A Heroine's Beginning by Generic-Fangirl. Part 1 of Marion's story. Marion is a lowborn girl with a love of stories and adventure. Life, however, is slightly different. At a young age, she goes to work at the local manor, which sets off a chain of events that will shape her life and her view of the world. Prologue. Accept my lot in life. That was always my biggest challenge. I was never quite satisfied with what I had. I am aware that makes me sound like a spoiled child, as so many in this world have it so much worse than I. But I could never help the way I feel. My fanciful imagination would never cease to torment me with wild adventures, epic quests, heroic deeds, and fantastical stories. However, real life is a sorry disappointment to my imagined world. All the responsibilities and bores of life could never compare to the stories in my head. As a lowborn girl, of no rank or money, no one has ever expected much from me. No one in the history of my family has done anything particularly worthy of note. Our small village has contained the same families for as far back as anyone can remember. And most people have the same back-breaking job for their entire lives. Farm laborers never rise above their station, and the local nobility do not really engage with us. However, our Lord does not mistreat us in any way, and his wife and daughters seem pleasant enough when they attend large gatherings. So from a very young age, I was taught to accept my station in life, and never aspire to anything higher. But however hard I tried to, I held on to my hopes of some sort of magical intervention that would save me from the dull life ahead. My parents are to blame for these hopes. They taught me to read and write, and tell me folk stories of our land as I fell asleep. As I got older, they told me to retell these stories to my younger siblings as they came along, as my mother grew more and more fatigued the more children she had. By the time little Gwyn was born, Mother had 8 children and a house to look after. So it was only natural that I, the eldest daughter, started to help out around the house, cleaning, cooking, and learning how to mend and sew. I exchanged my books for broom and stew pot. The task that I did, day in and day out, did not require much thinking, which afforded me more time to daydream about the tales of old. I would recite them to the little ones while I kneaded bread and scrubbed pots. The 5 boys would always prefer the stories of epic battles, ogre raids, wars, and sword fights, and I would often find them in the meadows outside of the village, reenacting the famous Battle of Hortensia, with little Robbie being lifted up onto Alexander's back, like he was riding a horse, and the 3-year-old screaming "Charge!" into Alexander's ears as he ran towards Daniel, who carried Tom on his back. Richard would always be sat on the grass, watching carefully for the moment for him to enter the battle as the legendary commander, the king who shared his name. They had played this scene so many times that he knew exactly the moment that his imaginary army would enter the fray, like they actually did so many years ago and win the battle for the Euphraeans. As soon as Tom jumped off Daniel's back to continue the fight desperately on foot, determined to conquer the land, Richard would race down the hill yelling, "Victory to Euphraenia!" at the top of his small voice. It always ended the same way, with Tom and Daniel being crushed by the other 3 lying on top of them, all giggling the way boys do after running around. The girls, however, preferred to listen to the stories of romance and magic. Clara sat dreamy-eyed as I retold the story of the golden-haired princess trapped in a tower until she runs away and discovers her magical powers and sets off all alone to find her missing family. Clara sighs loudly as I dramatize the meeting of the princess with a servant boy in the forest who assists her in her quest. At the end of the story, when the princess, now discovering her identity, chooses a simple life with a servant boy over her royalty, Clara always smiles gleefully to herself. I dare say she holds out hopes to one day be as loved by someone. Gwen, however, was still just a baby, and didn't have much of a preference over story genre. She mainly just gurgled at most things. But as is the way with the world, when a poor family has 8 children, the income of one laborer father cannot sustain the household for very long. Mother used to work a little when there were less of us, but her tiredness had grown so that now it was impossible for her to work. Therefore, it was left to me to leave home and find a position. At the age of 14, I packed my bag of 3 dresses, all with my name stitched into the back by my mother, and moved out of my family home. I found a position as a scullery maid to the lord of the manor, Sir Henry. I had seen him and his family a few times in my life, and knew that the daughter could not be more than 1 or 2 years older than myself. She was a pretty blonde thing, who had always seemed full of life whenever I could catch a glimpse of her. Maybe I could see her more now that I was to live with them, in the attic, but still with them nonetheless. As much as I loathed being parted from my family, I knew it was not permanent. They still lived in the same village as me, and I would have Sunday afternoons off to visit them, and the position I held was not going to be a terrible one. So that day, I left that poor cottage with my head held high, my mind still full of stories, and my heart full of hopes. How little I knew then what was to come, and how that magic intervention which I so prayed for would change my life in ways I could not conceive of then. For as I later learned, magic is very real, and I should have been more careful what I wished for. What a fool I was.